Okay, launching now, guys. Sorry for the delay.
All right, here we are. We are live. Good evening, Augustonians. I'm happy to welcome you again to Lit Friday and to spring. In an effort to provide some breathing room and some room to imagine and some room to dream, tonight and next month, we're doing poetry readings with incredible Black writers. Tonight, we welcome Crystal Boson, Rio Cortez, and Arvo Villars. And on May 28th, we will welcome Josh Aiken, Nicholas Goodley, and Malcolm Tarek. On June 25th, we will have spoken word poet Ariana Brown with us for a pre-launch preview party for her forthcoming book, We Are Owed, which explores Black relationality in Mexican and Mexican-American spaces. And Ariana's book, We Are Owed, as Brown searches for other Black kin in the same spaces through which she moves, her experiences of Blackness are placed in conversation with the histories of formerly enslaved Africans in Texas and Mexico. These past few weeks have been especially complex for the Black community as we witness the full conviction of George Floyd's murderer and continue to experience losses as the result of police brutality and neglect in our communities. I also want to acknowledge that since the beginning of 2021, we've lost 15 lives in the Black transgender community. A practice of Lit Friday is to take a collective breath in refusal of the perpetual threatening of our breaths. So with our invited authors and guests and everyone with us, I'm going to ask that we all inhale, 1, 2, 3, hold, and exhale, 1, 2, 3. Thank you for being with all of us. Tonight, we're going to read in alphabetical order, which means first we'll have Crystal Boson, next Rio Cortez, and finally Arvo Villars. And before each poet reads, I'm going to introduce them so that way we'll have a little break in between readings. We are open for audience questions as well. So if you have questions during the readings for any of the authors, just drop them in the Q&A chat. And then once the readings are over, we'll ask questions and get to know each other a little bit better. And without further ado, here's Crystal Boson's bio. Crystal Boson writes short, dense poems that lay bare the complicated geographies of the United States and the lives of Black, queer, and marginalized bodies that dwell within its boundaries. She currently writes about and resides in the Midwest. She is a Cave Canem and Callaloo Fellow and was awarded the Langston Hughes Creative Writing Award in 2014. She has work published in Blueshift Journal, Pank, Parcel, among other locations. Most recently, her work, The Bitter Map, was selected as the winner of the 2017 Honeysuckle Press Chapbook Contest by Saeed Jones. Thanks for being with us, Crystal. Take us away.
Thank everyone so much for having me here. Like Jessica says, I write about the landscape a lot, and funny story, I'm calling you from my car because I am literally in a small migration right now. We are driving from Kansas City to Houston to be with my family. And so I figured I'd read a bunch of my leaving Kansas and going to Texas poems for you. They are very short, so you'll be getting quite a few of them, and you are very welcome. So I wanted to start with a title poem. It's called The Bitter Map, and it very much talks about the feeling I'm feeling right now of driving through America, through Texas as a Black woman. So, Bitter Map. Good God, all I'm asking for is one damn place on one damn map that I won't die in or get into. Amen. And again, sitting awkwardly in a rest stop 90 miles out of Navasota, hoping I don't die here, so sitting poems. So I'm hour 9 into my 12-hour drive, and this drive is kind of magical in a way where it really connects me with my past and my family and my ancestors who live in this area and the people I've left behind when I left. And I keep seeing crows along this drive. Every day I see at least 2 crows. So I wanted to read you 12 hours as the crow flies to sort of bring along our side passengers with us. You know what a long drive is? It's watching the clouds starve themselves from the front seat of your car. It's hearing the shifting in your trunk of red clay dust and dead birds. Listen to the hungry song change from branded meat to dry corn. Know that both the drought and God are following you home. As I said, these are short and you get a lot of them. When I'm writing a lot, I write about rain, I write about droughts, and because I'm Texan, I write about how there's almost like this biblical weight tying to all of them. And I write about either prayers or the book of Leviticus. And I wanted to share with you my favorite Leviticus poems. These are small micro poems that come from a larger collection, the Good Book of Leviticus. So, chapter 16, verse 10. That ain't how we do it here. First, we gotta run ya. Get a taste of fear to marinate in the blood. We're gonna herd you to wet corners. We're gonna brand you with our name. And then we're gonna kick your ass. Chapter 7, verse 2. Son, there's always a price for fucking all the way up another man's jaw. Some days you pay blood. Some days you pay cash. But most days you buy bleach for your jeans. Chapter 18, verse 19. I'm not supposed to touch nothing that bleeds damn near a week and only just wants to die. Chapter 8, verse 24. You sure do say a lot of things. Chapter 19, verse 17. What I need to know now is how much land got to stretch between my front door and your front door till we ain't neighbors no more. And chapter 15, verse 31. It's for reasons like this that your kind of folks got their own side of town. As I keep thinking about prayers and moving in the landscape and just living in it, I wanted to sort of make a tangible map of where I've been and where I'm going and where I keep coming back to. And I keep thinking there'll be a change between Texas and there'll be different in Kansas, there'll be different in Missouri, and just some place will be better than the last. They're really just the same landscape with a slightly different sky. And thinking about that, I crafted this poem called Kansas Up South. You see, the thing of it is, it's about wanting to go home. Texas was the sun bubbling on the tongue every August. It's the uniform boy with the off stare and his daddy's good name. And the man behind the desk looking me dead in the eye and saying, I think I know what you should be afraid of around here. Kansas is the wind freezing hard my eye whites come November. It's the grown man with the off stare and his buddy's good name. And the man behind the desk looking me dead in the eye and saying, there are two sides to every story, especially from folks like you round here. Texas was the sickle burr stuck in the soft meat in the mid part of my shoe. Kansas is the recoil and the gun scope and all those cracked bones around my eye. Also, I just want to pause and say, I really miss people. I really miss being live with people, reading, and just feeling everyone's just hope and energy. And so, reading from my car in North Texas with some weirdo looking into my car right now is weird. But carrying on, back to landscapes. When I left Kansas and from Texas to back to Kansas, there was a stop in Oregon between there. And a couple of folks know me from when I was in Oregon when I was just not at my best, because if Texas is rough and Kansas is rough, Oregon is something else. And so in all of my leaving, I specifically penned this poem called Oregon Goddamn. If you had loved me, you wouldn't have sent me north. They got no blood, got no salt, got no scripture, no teeth. There ain't anything here. Settling in is a fire ant on the meat part of your thigh. Heading out is a devil about to lay hands on his wife. I wanted to end up with my 3 favorite poems, all very short, but all very much sort of that position myself in the world as a poet, as a Black queer woman, just as a living being who survives disaster and survives catastrophe and keeps moving. And so I wanted to start the 3 by offering you my absolute favorite, God Willin' and the Creek. Granddaddy paid for this land, and these trifling ass levees can't hold in a piss. We got water, rot, and no floor. We ain't leaving this house. Crawdads in the carpet mean we ain't gonna starve. So go and wait out the rain. We can't move on out where the devil moves in. My second favorite, the one I think of every day, positioning myself in America, with the people in my house, with the people in my work. What it is to be a white man. Come on outside. Bring the good knife. Pick a pig. Any pig. Learn to kill a sweet thing that can't harm you. And I want to end with my poem that's my personal call to action. It's called Backsliding. Mostly rains hard when you're sleeping. Comes down mean as a branch, peeled green down to a switch, waiting for an ass by the back porch. We can't baptize in floods. This here ain't a sprinkle. This here ain't a dunk. Feels like God is a woman who cooks 8 grits at night. Thank y'all very much. Please be safe.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I always long for and wait for and welcome the return of the Hate Grits poem. It was one of the first of your poems I ever read when we met and became friends at Cave Canem. And so I'm always happy to see it again. I really appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you, and I always read that poem specifically for you.
Thank you. Our next reader is Rio Cortez. Rio Cortez is a poet and the NYT New York Times bestselling author of The ABCs of Black History from Workman. It was published in 2020, and Golden Axe, which is forthcoming from Penguin in 2021 this year. So got a lot of good reading coming up. Thank you so much for being with us, Rio.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
That's an honor.
And Crystal, thank you so much for that reading from the road. And I hope that you're safe into your next stop. It was really beautiful to hear your words. So I'm just going to read a few. I'm going to read a few new poems. I grew up in Utah, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and my family has been there for many generations since Reconstruction, where they went west after being enslaved in Louisiana. And so I have some poems about that, and then I have a couple of poems. I've been imagining, I really loved the television show Frasier Crane's Radical Departure and Shift, but there I have some poems where, as a Black woman, I get to inhabit Frasier, if anyone has seen that. So I'll share a few of those. They're both very different. I'll start with a Fraser poem, actually. This is Fraser Crane toasts no one in particular. To complete one rotation on the air and fall into a bathtub of lavender and orange peel. To unzip my squash racket and hit a volley beyond the oak tree. To shop for a silk dressing gown and then to give it as a gift. To a dinner reservation my friends could not have gotten. The opera too. I've always loved a cortado in the afternoon. An absolute distilled with foamy milk, but still an absolute. I raise my tiny glass of sherry, were it Fino or Oloroso, I could tell you in an instant. I've known just one irrepressible sound, and it's rainfall. And I guess I'll sort of transition. I'll transition a little bit. This poem is called Self-Portrait in a Tanning Bed. It's February and I'm the only Black girl at Future Tan Tanning Salon. I laugh when I enter my private room and see an African mask above the clothes racks. I am getting tired of irony, naked climbing onto the plexiglass and hearing it creak. I wonder, like any other moment alone, what if I die like this? What if the plastic gives and I'm torched by 24 ultraviolet glass rods? I gently close the canopy of the Sun Capsule Supercyclone 350. Wrapped in its purple cylinders of light, I can see myself reflected back with tiny goggles. At first, I think I look like a reverse coon with huge black eyes, but I like the way I look. Darker and like a time traveler, how my breasts must sometimes appear like this to my lover. I think I'm sad or something. Worry how much time has passed since I've been here. I agree with Crystal that I miss being in person. I feel like my face was doing things as you read and you couldn't see, and I miss just the expressions of people around. And but it's sunset in Harlem, and so I have no major complaints. I'm going to read this poem. It's called Visiting Whitney Plantation. It's my mother and partner and I made a road trip back to Louisiana, to the land where my family once lived enslaved, and we did this together. And this is one of the visits we made when we were there. Clouds hanging so low, they almost touch the wooden colonnettes of the big house. The brick held together by animal fur and mud, fuselage, the hands that formed it. I raise my arm and rub the belly of a cloud. Our tour guide is Black and doesn't remark on architectural flourishes. I'm grateful and still wiping sweat from my brow. We are in Wallace, Louisiana, looking for our people's names now upon a marble wall of 70,000 first names in no particular order. I sidestep a white man with a camera so that I can take my mother's hand from her mouth and hold it. On the way to New Orleans, we stop to gather Spanish moss. A groundsman opens the gate after hours. He looks softly after my mother and me. Could it be that he is one of us? I fill my purse with Spanish moss and unlock the rental car. How cruel the sun must have been to the slave, I think, when I get back to our French Quarter hotel and lay poolside in a two-piece, desperate almost. Then I'll read a couple of new ones. When I was young, I learned to shoot a bow, like a bow, an arrow. And so this is a poem about that and about other stuff too. I learned to shoot a bow. It is no river Jordan which flows back between the railroad tracks and the porch. It's a canal, not unlike my mother, low as it wanna be and fullest when it rains, existing for however long without a name, sweet smelling and under a timber bridge that we built. We built that. Isn't that our story? To be denied the beginning. I crossed the bridge to shoot a sapling bow my grandfather has carved. He helps me aim into cardboard flats stacked against the willow. I guess this is where I am Orion, with two birth stories. In one story, I come from a sea god with the forest as my mother, and in the other, I have no mother at all. So that's a sonnet, and I think I will read two more sonnets and see where that leaves us. This sonnet is called As Cain, and it has a little beginning piece that I'll read that helps contextualize it. It says, until 1978, Mormons maintained that in a spiritual pre-existence, Blacks were neutral bystanders when other spirits chose sides during a fight between God and Lucifer. For that failure of courage, they were condemned to become the accursed descendants of Cain. I think of the earth that drank Abel's blood as I pull up foxtail from my garden. Earth, not passive, but cursed by God, having accepted death and maybe even hope to grow from it. And Cain said to Abel, let us go to the field. I cut my own thumb on a weed. I carry out a strict ritual of healing, cold hose water, and then most holy mouth. Tell me, what mark has God given me? I am paraphrasing here when I say God told Cain to rule over his own longing, or else restless wanderer shall he be on earth. First curse, then blessing. God's always changing his mind about us. And then one more sonnet. This is called Covered Wagon, a Spaceship. Standing unseen in the little blue stem, not nearly and not quite used to living, I consider whether it's aliens that brought Black folks to the canyons, the valley. Standing in the great evaporation of a lake, holy dandelion for eyes, full and white and searching the landscape for understanding. How do you come to be where there are no others except science fiction? I am a child feeling unusual, whose history untold is being left with no one else to blame. Maybe aliens who must have had their reasons. Anyway, it begins with abduction. So I'll stop there, but thank you again. I'm so excited to be reading with you all this evening, and I'll turn it over to Jessica.
That was amazing. The abduction definitely is something that I think about often, and I'm happy to find it in writing, especially your writing. And then also thinking about God keeps changing his mind about us, and how much the collation of Black history and African history has so much to do with missionary work and the complex relationship that we have to those histories. As we know, that's colonization didn't happen without that. And what does it mean to have 19th and 20th century iterations of Christianity that kind of still talk about Black people, but even further outside of the historization of our relationship with Christianity, to kind of add another layer to it. And so I really, really love all of the poems, but those two things kind of stuck on me. really, 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 really closely. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica.
Now I'm going to introduce Arvo Villars. And Arvo Villars' bio is as short as one of Crystal's poems, and it goes, Arvo Villars is a poet in Brooklyn. Thank you for joining us, Arvo.
Thank you so much for having me. Can everybody hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to both poets that came before me. I enjoyed the readings thoroughly. My the work that I'm going to share with you today is a little bit different. I originally was going to share some work that is on violence that I've been sort of like dealing with, whether it's like in race or elsewhere. But I found it difficult I don't think that it's quite ready for the public. And so I'm going to share a few poems that are older. And some of them are quite playful, just because I like to play with language, and some of them are much more serious towards the end. If you don't glean a meaning directly from them, then don't worry. It's probably easier to glean it from the page. But here it is.
Thank you.
Black Charm. It was there in that small ocean that the birds sat having what you call aperitifs, playing stale chansonnettes. I was to warn the kombuchas to pearl the pine firs. Instead, I convened with the blue comatos, flattening the yeast the arawaks mocked twice a leap. Sold my belongings to a leaf, who ate silk and drunk burns for breath with sworn jurors. Who knew how loud a plain eclipse was? I was stunned. No bark to saw but build, with way over way, 2 full holes black between the green moon and the eraser. This is called colors. Blues, rusting yellow, with feathered orchids for hair, stamp love on her skull. Red, bluer than blue, splattered on redder than freed soil. Give up, Cecilia, the land said. Cecilia, Ceci, say. How easy it is to erase rusting yellows. How easy to let blues blue into zombie. How easy is. You want to breathe, Cecilia? You want to dream, Ceci? I want to soar. I want to soar like rusting yellows bursting into reds. Then soar, say, you've tried before. Don't mock me. You should know I have daughters. You should know I have blues rusting yellows bursting into reds. This is called the dancer. My neighbor is Nomio. He gyrates like an ant, marching to the stench of his own map, like color in insolent winds. Someone has to remind life of purple skunk and death of its future. Degrees. Lo, the virtues of boredom, another morning of reflection, general provision for negation. Ha finds PP long stockings in a black and white pothole. She runs, gets a tin can, then scoops herself out. La folle poursuit la ligne de fuite. Bang bang, B, traitor. Bang bang, B, unknowable. Analytics. A coy girl tipping into swollen calls dances in the jaw cage of a sultry poise. The tongue is hanging for the saunter of a meddling twirl. Memory blushes, taste, brush, smell, catch, and learn in the on. A somber wonders how knowing will give in pain and buds, in restraint and weakness, in subtlety and drink. Settle your irides. Remember, you will need all of your life in one death. The poem. Quieter than the silence I am in, as though my soul always understood the language of repose, as though I were gratitude and not this moment's servant, as though time conspired with a separate time's time, as though the noise of noise made no in this stanza, as though I could only see from here, from this bowl of roses, from this eye. A way forward. There it is, my wind in a room smaller than old boy's suitcase. The constant louder than an unknown hand on the back of a young muse. There, my violence conquered nightly for another sensei's cymbals. There, my womb rebirthing coffee for celestial levity under a lawful tree. This poem is called Width. It's a series of poems that are pretty dense, thought-owned, dramatizing urgency towards an inelegant incandescence. Wood, in lubricated machine of cultural insignificance and filial splendor. Seared gradient districts, justifying intrinsic values of divisible accord. Consensus for mea culpa of none, and suppression of all sense acute partiality. Sheet of race marching in one kindness, a spear. The reversal of millennia of conflation from, of, at, board of social constructors. Dashing soar of ominous baseness, barking a purr at the balance of a glorious high noon firmament. The human fault line. Unpoised flower hoarding unconvinced love to give life to 613 sadnesses. Right fault, burying shadow in sepulchred sepal to appease hatred of cinnamon sphinx. Babylonian weakness or strength, appropriating mimetic spectacle to sneer at oppressive rawness. Glistening gillettes, correcting hunger on worshipping and unsuspecting Mardi Gras believers. Broken voiced poem, gulping drunkenness to liberate well-hung phallus at deserving bully. And this is the last poem. It's called Measures of Worth. Throat 100 times cleared at 1,000 decibels. Anger at putrid layers 2/3 folded on a warm subway car. A billion absorptions within seconds of dynamic twerking bell. Blind eatery of just corn and fattiest resigned lard. Foreigners buying prime American real estate with cash. Freely arrested feet at calm, friendly, and solar bright insult. Fulsome lonesomes drinking cold beers with some cash. Mea culpa without understanding or cultivated belief in fault. Haitian monkeys paraded with branded Sita scarlet letter. Fun butterfly with charming aplomb and cocaine confidence. Patriotic sandwiches asserting a political pout with Cuban settlers. Fear-trembling backyard with slippery, expensive, and unintimidating fence. Last-minute competition alarm to salvage the forgotten education. Silicon Valley of mythical gods and Silicon Alley of terrestrial philosophers. Beachfront net neutrality for posterity with regimented machinations. Independent labor with negative balance and unknown exponents in coffers. Limits to how small a beggar worth given to is allowed to make himself. Appalled certainty shouting, "You lie," at perceptive socialist Mexican president. Subversive reduced to success by art piece, least like himself. Absurd pace and enclosed face to create life beyond precedent. Lazy content-seeking rhyme, unconcerned with hypertrophic posture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arvo. The thing about your work that always strikes me is how you hold the intimate complexity of landscape and the way that it's shaped by larger relations without really kind of hammering the point home on the head, right? You leave a lot of space for the mind to come to its own agreements between the height of like violences between the individual and governments and all kinds of different layers of relations, while also considering the way that people's bodies will mimic flora, mimic fauna, become a part of where they are while also resisting against it in like very specific and challenging ways. And so I was very excited to have you come read, because I know that your work on the paper takes a study, right? It takes you kind of grappling with your own way of receiving certain symbols and images as a way to kind of get into it. You can't get into your work without knowing kind of you have to know something about yourself, right? And you have to bring it with you if you're going to read it. So I really, really appreciate you sharing. And so we have about 15 or so, 17 minutes for conversation. So if everyone who has the ability to become visible can come visible, that would be great, because I have some questions. Welcome back. Oh my God, Crystal, you're like actually driving. You're like on the road, the car is moving. So, okay, we all know as poets, right, how readers often will conflate the production with like the person, right? And sometimes that's what the author wants and sometimes it's not. And so I know that from just personally having the advantage of knowing each of you in like special ways in like my own life, that there's a certain amount of biography that informs the work before it gets into the way the imagination will develop an idea. So if each of you could tell me, like, where is it that you get out of yourself from a poem and like into the new thing you're trying to create? Where in the river of biography do you like take flight from that and go into the work that you're doing?
Who wants to start that one?
I can say something if I typically try to start with a feeling or like something that I'm dealing with in real life, and try to create something that I won't recognize, honestly. Something that feels more like a sculpture instead of like something that I know. I think, like, generally speaking, I want the biography for me to recognize it, but for the person reading it to just be engaging with the language. But that's because I just feel like I always like playing with language and doing experiments.
I mean, for me, I'm actually writing a really personal collection right now I've had a lot of loss in COVID, and trying to figure out like the separation of what's for me and what's for others. I kind of think about it just like planting a tree. It's my labor, it's something I put into the world, and something I have to walk away from, and people can approach the work and see it's me and see it's mine. They also have to like do their own interpretation and encounter in a way that's meaningful to them. But like, it's my word to myself, I'm putting it to the ground basically. I'm not really concerned with that separation, like thinking about where the exact line is, but more the work of just making something that can grow.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. For me, I look at history as that place where it begins. So I feel like sometimes when I'm writing a poem, not the kind of poems that like run through you out of nowhere, but the ones where I'm sitting down and I'm thinking about the work of poetry, I think I first think of my history on Earth, history in period, Black folks' history, as it intersects with my own. And then from there, I think sometimes the poem just does its own thing, like it just sort of decides where it wants to go. I don't think I ever sit down and I'm like, I'm going to write about this one thing. It starts out that way, and then it just sort of like, I mean, they're like these living, breathing things on their own. But I think I start with history. And in my case, I think of Black American history in the West. And then from there, yeah.
I think what's interesting is that oftentimes the part of the work of being Black is always refreshing the conversation around Blackness and how it moves, right? And so thinking specifically about language, earlier today I was writing a paper and I was kind of breaking down subjectivity, objectivity, and then just jacked as like a postfix, and thinking about that movement as far as like, it's like this continuous kind of cyclical kind of throwing, like a continuous arcing that I think reminds me of how Blackness moves in different places in the world, and especially in the Americas. And each of you come from very specific personal experiences of Blackness. And how do you think about Blackness in your work, if you think about it at all, for coming from your each very like specific backgrounds of the diaspora?
I guess I'll answer. I think about it all the time. I think it's very hard to like move away from it, particularly now. I mean, I sobbed for 2 weeks straight every time I saw anything related to George Floyd, for instance. And so that's in part why I didn't want to share new pages, because I wasn't quite ready, and etc. But it may not necessarily sort of like come out, like you'll see a line that you recognize, because I'm playing with language, in part because I speak French, I speak other languages, and so like that's why I think I'm always like interested in how like other people think about language, kind of thing. But if as you're reading my work, there are definitely the themes, and one of them is race. One of them is like gender. As a woman, it matters to me greatly, like thinking about power structures. That all comes out in my work quite a bit. And so I think it's inescapable, to be honest. I just don't think necessarily, there are poems that it's front and center, like it's like obvious that that's what I'm talking about, but there are poems that you have to like seek it out, but it's always there. Yeah, that's what I would say for myself.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like Blackness is ever present in my work and for me, and because I honestly write about landscape more than people, it's really focusing on me and people being able to imagine Blackness in spaces where I wouldn't necessarily put us. So like, oh, Texas is for rural white people, and like Kansas is for corn and cows and no human beings allowed. Like I want to help put Blackness in a different imaginary where we can exist weirdly and authentically in all the spaces that we do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think about that about Black people in the mountains, which was my particular experience growing up. But I also think, like you're saying, just it's specifically, I never try to speak for all Black folks. So I'm specifically talking about my own Blackness, which is ever present and something that is in all of my poems indirectly or directly. And sometimes for me, Blackness means other things. It means loneliness, or it means longing, and so a poem could be about that. But for me, that's still about Blackness. It just looks a little bit different.
And so I also noticed in all of your work that there's this absence of how would I say it, like habeas corpus, like you may have the body, you present the body. And I think a lot of work that's in the world is trying to kind of circulate around understanding the levels of violence we experience throughout the Americas by always in the poem having the structure of the poem imitate the dead Black body, right? Or try to assess the afterlife, the potentiality for continued energetic existence of that body beyond what's been done to it through police brutality, gendered violence, and also, like misogynoir, et cetera. And so I noticed in your works that violence and conflict are discussed, or even sometimes not even violence, but like this ambivalence to interacting with something that could potentially be violent, like in the poem where Rio, where you go into the tanning bed and you see the African mask, obviously associating like tanning and tropics and exoticism to a specific kind of global experience. But the character has this kind of recognition, but also ambivalence, and kind of sees the moment where it could be something heavy or it could not be something heavy. And so how do you guys work around, you can't avoid Blackness in your work, but there's also this way that you all are very intimately and skillfully holding that violence in a way that is not re-traumatizing. And you get the point across of how deep the impact is without the poem having to be almost like an imagistic image of Black death again, again, again. Could you each talk about that?
For myself, it's interesting. The body does appear for me when I'm talking about gender. And in fact, in the past, it's always appeared for me when I'm talking about gender. Except like much more recently because of the violence around gender. I mean, like there's like, I think I mentioned this to you once, that there was a woman who was beaten on the eyelid or something like that in New York. Because somebody was trying to talk to her and she wasn't having it. And because I don't know, for some reason, because it's gotten closer to my body in a very real way, I haven't been able to talk about it. But generally speaking, I would say, like, for me, the formula that I do is really try to like intellectualize it, like to make it intellectual, to objectify it in some way, so that so that I'm able to see it, first of all, in a way that like creates distance, and so I can process it and think about it, and so that other people can experience it in different ways where it's not always brutal. Yeah, I think like that's the way I work with it, because I do need to objectify it a bit, in order to process it for myself. And I think it's useful possibly for readers to do the same.
I mean, for me, I try really hard to not purposely like depict violence against Black bodies, because one, we have enough of that in every incarnation that we see ourselves. And I want to leave more room for imagination, for us to see ourselves differently. And it's not just, Blackness doesn't always equate pain, and Blackness doesn't always equate violence, but there's room for faith and space and love and laughter and all the things that like I want to focus on a creative and invitational humanity that also includes violence, but it doesn't solely focus on it. But I mean, I also keep being told that I write about bodies like they're landscapes and landscapes like they're people. But for me, it's all the same thing. It's just this feeling of connectedness in space and imagination where violence is possible, but it's not the only possibility.
Yeah, wow. I'm trying to think about violence in my poems and what I do. I think what's really compelling to me, well, first I'll say, I think when you love Black folks, it is really hard to see them brutalized. It's really traumatizing to see images like that, and it's just as hard to write that. And so I think it would be interesting to see non-Black folks write about trauma of Black people. I think it would maybe be more grotesque. But when you love us, it's just hard to do that. But I think what is very compelling sometimes to me is to evoke fear in a poem with other things, images, or like a tone of like anxiety maybe, or like something ominous is coming or something threatening, but not actually the act of violence, but just, I think sometimes when I'm thinking about that kind of thing, darkness in that way, I think I try to set a tone like that, rather than show the brutality of violence. But.
And this question is actually kind of like, hola extempore. I'm sorry, Arvo, I'm horrible at French. But thinking about, something that you said, Arvo, about sometimes you're so close or so immersed in an experience that you have to find your way into like writing about the politics, writing about the machinations of things. And I know that as a writer, when it's time for me to write about politics, my move is to pick out a very close-up relation, an interaction, and a conversation, because it takes me so long to process the trauma of like this huge, right, had this huge happening. Because every time we have to kind of welcome somebody into ancestorship as a result of police brutality, it's huge, right? Because it kind of is like watching a pail overflow sometimes with rainwater. But thinking about, how do you guys prepare to enter into poems that seem kind of big, right? And so not so much the question of like, how do you reframe it, but how do you personally prepare yourself, or when you know that it's time to sit and write about these things that can sometimes seem like overwhelming? And then what's your self-care afterwards, if any at all?
I have I used to go through the process of like honoring the moment. That's actually how I came to poetry, and just like however much, if it's a morsel, if it's just like a little bit of it that I can deal with in the moment, then that's what I'll reflect in the poem. But and then after you sort of like, when you're full, you kind of know, your body knows, at least like my body knows, like when I'm full and I'm ready to write about things, my body knows, and I need to sit somewhere, and I need to be quiet, and I need to like be alone quite a bit. When I'm empty too, my body knows, like the work is different, and the language that I'm using is different. So I think like currently I've been feeling quite full, and I've been trying to like figure out ways of like writing. And it's weird because usually I will go to the page even if it's difficult and it's painful. Much more lately though, I don't know if it's the pandemic or what about like that whole situation, but it's been very difficult for me to go to the page. But I feel full, and I know I will produce something with it. It just sometimes can be difficult to do. In terms of like repairing, I think, I don't know, sometimes it can take quite a few months for me to repair, to regain some of my strength. So I'm probably not the best person to talk about this with.
I really like the language of full and empty that you were using, because that's really close to how I feel about it. I've lost 12 people in my life in the pandemic, and I've been writing about them, and I usually wait till it's late at night when I've been fasting, so I'm empty. And like I just write and like let their stories and let their words and let those memories fill me up, where I have this absence I know I need to fill in. And then the way I repair myself from that is like I will cook and eat. I know that's like the southerner in me, but like I will plan while I'm writing just like how to heal, and just to really be present in things that will fill me up besides the memory and besides the words. And that's been my process of late night writing and then next day eating. And that's kind of been my cycle of work and healing.
Yeah, I like that. Also, the full and the empty analogy also feels true to me. It's hard. It's hard not to feel. It's hard not to feel numb around things politically in the world. And I've been trying to read more political poets, and I think a lot about that Audre Lorde poem about rage. And when I get to a point where I'm like, I'm going to write a poem on this, like about my rage or about my grief or something like that, it does take so much. And I don't know, I think repair could be months for sure for me too, or just it's hard. I just recently went on a writing retreat with a couple of friends who are writers of prose, and they would write all day long, and I would write a few lines, and I would literally need to just be like, okay, well, that's it for the day. I think it's just something. I don't know how to compare poetry and prose, but that was one example for me where I was like, this is just emotionally exhausting. It doesn't even matter what I'm writing about. It's just taking from me. It's taking, and now I need to fill up in whatever way that is. Not for, I'm a terrible cook, so it's not cooking for me, but you know, a face mask, a quiet moment alone, something else. But yeah, I relate to the empty and the fullness, and yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here with us today. We went a little over because we started a little late, but we're happy that you're all here. I'm so happy that you guys are here and that you read and that you shared. And then I don't know, I'm just like overjoyed. But remember, everyone who's tuned in, next month, we have Josh Aiken, Nicholas Goodley, and Malcolm Tarek. And then in June, on the 25th, we have Ariana Brown coming. And everyone in your homes, give these amazing writers and poets and a round of applause and all of my appreciation. And say hello to Brian and give my love to Finn and take my love, Arvo. And y'all take my love too. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Jessica.